Hello everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of Closed by Mo. My name is Mohammed. I'm hopefully your favorite YouTube host on most things real estate. I'm also a real estate broker and an investor in New York City. And in this week's video, we're going to be talking about something, or should I say dissecting something that has made the headlines a couple of months ago that I sort of haven't posted about, not quite frequently, because I think it was important for me to understand it myself quite well and figure it out how to distill it enough to be able to explain it to folks that may be watching it or hearing about it for the very first time, because this does affect you if you're a buyer, a seller, or even a real estate professional in the industry across the board. Without further ado, let's jump right into talking a little bit more about the NAR, or the National Association of Realtors settlement, and how that changes processes moving forward. Let's go. Now, to clarify, this video is going to be divided into a couple of different segments. The first segment is going to be basically where I give you an overview of how the current scenario is working and why there might be a couple of concerns, basically what the lawsuit was pointing out. The second segment is what's going to happen now after the settlement goes into effect in July once the judge signs it, assuming that's exactly what's going to happen. And the third segment is going to be effectively Mo's thoughts on the process, and I've looked through a couple of different data sources, but basically my thoughts and opinions on how I think this is going to affect the market, how I think the market is going to play out over the long term, and number three, what I'm doing to change my own processes. Now, to begin us off with, effectively the way the market is currently being run. So as of May 2024, this is an overview of how your local market is probably working, at least for me in New York City and Long Island. If you were to approach a buyer's broker, let's say you are a property owner, and you say, hey, you know what? I want to sell my house and I want to move whatever else I want to do. I don't want to do it myself. I'm going to hire a listing agent to be able to take care of that. You interview a bunch of agents and you're like, hey, you land on one person that does a really good job, you think, and you want to hire them. So the listing agent is going to negotiate with you as the property owner in terms of their overall commission rate. Whether it's 4%, 5%, 6%, that is the full commission that you will be having to pay. Nothing extra on top of that unless there's a different negotiation happening. But that's the full commission that you're going to be expected to pay at closing day from your sale proceeds. And I want to clarify something. Commission has always been and will continue to be negotiable regardless of whatever the lawsuit and settlement sort of claim, right? So always keep that in the back of your mind. Doesn't matter what you've sort of written down, there might be room for negotiation with different brokers involved in the transaction. Now, if you're the property owner and you agree to, let's say, a 5% listing fee with a listing agent because you think they do an amazing job and they're not going to have any problem with selling your house and managing that entire process from start to finish, that 5% is oftentimes going to be shared with the buyer's broker if there's a buyer's broker involved. Meaning, if there's a buyer that comes to the property and they're already working with an agent, from that 5% that the listing agent negotiated with you, Mr. or Mrs. Homeowner, from that 5%, a certain chunk of it is going to be allocated for the buyer's broker. From that 5%, it might be 4%, it might be 3%, 2, 1, it might even be 0.5%, it might even be $5,000, it might be $10,000. Effectively, what I'm trying to say is from that 5%, a chunk of that commission is going to go to the buyer's broker if there is a buyer's broker involved. Now, to clarify here, effectively, when the listing agent signs a listing agreement with you as a property owner, when they upload it into the MLS, they can input in how much of that percentage is going to be allocated to the buyer's broker, assuming you and the listing broker and the property owner have agreed to how much of that is going to be shared with the buyer's broker, or if there's any changes in terms of like a flat fee or whatever it is. But you get the point. The listing broker is going to be able to advertise in the system how much they want to be able to share with the cooperating buyer's broker if the buyer's broker is bringing the buyer. And when I say in the system, I basically mean in the MLS. Now, this is where the lawsuit is basically identifying a couple of different concerns. If a buyer is working with the buyer's broker and the buyer's broker is obviously incentivized to, number one, not just get the best deal for the client, but also for them to make the most money, if there's 100 different listings in your area and they see that one of the listings is advertising a higher commission rate than all the other listings, basically what the lawsuit is saying is that the less than unscrupulous brokers will be incentivized to push their clients towards that particular listing, and they may even try to be disingenuous about it and say that this property is actually better than the other ones, or anything else that may not be in the client's actual best favor, because at the end of the day, if that listing is promoting or advertising in the system a higher percentage commission, then the buyer's broker has an incentive to push their buyers to that, right? Now, we can get into the whole conversation about, well, everything has a monetary incentive. Does that mean it's a bad thing? Does that mean it's a good thing? I'm not here to discuss politics or anyone's personal opinions. I'm just telling you what the lawsuit is basically identifying, right? So, just to recap, if you're a property owner and you hire a listing agent and you agree to 5% listing compensation, 5% commission on listing compensation, the listing agent will advertise in the MLS, okay, from that 5%, how much percentage do I want to give to the buyer's broker? Whether that's 2%, so it's still a total of 5%, or whether it's 4% for the listing agent, 1% for the buyer's agent. Sometimes it's split right in the middle, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's lower for the buyer's agent, sometimes it's higher. It really depends on the market and how that overall split is going to be coming down. But again, I want to clarify, there's no standard split. There is no, lack of wiggle room here. There's always negotiation up or down. Buyer agents can submit offers with higher commission amounts than what's listed in the MLS, right? That's just part of the game. It's part of the process, right? Especially for an experienced buyer's broker. So effectively, what the lawsuit is claiming is, hey, look, this might cause steering. Steering, aka a buyer's broker might say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer that we've been working with, I like this property better because of X, Y, and Z, and I think we should make an offer on this one, not on these other ones, unbeknownst to the buyers that this property that the buyer's broker is steering them towards actually has a higher compensation for the buyer broker, and that's why they're doing it, not because he or she thinks it's better for their clients. The second thing that the lawsuit is basically claiming is that the seller should have more control over whether or not they want to be able to even pay the buyer's broker, which I sort of have mixed feelings about, but I understand where they're coming from, right? So if you as a property owner, or me as the property owner, if I work with an agent and I'm paying them to sell the house, I don't want to have to be responsible for paying the buyer's broker, right? Even though the fee that I'm paying the listing agent is going to be shared with the buyer's broker, I want to be able to control, and I want to be able to give the control to the buyer's broker, if there is a buyer's broker, in terms of how much commission I agree to pay to that broker. I understand, again, I'm not disagreeing with it, I'm not agreeing with it, I'm just saying this is where it's sort of laid out. And from the seller's perspective, I sort of get it, I understand. If you might think, well, hey, if I'm paying 5% and that's covering one agent, but now two agents, then technically, if there's only one agent involved, or if there's still two agents, but I'm the only one that hired this listing agent, I should be able to negotiate only on the fee that my listing agent is charging, not be forced to pay for the buyer's broker. I get it. I don't necessarily agree or disagree, but I understand where they're coming from. Effectively, this is what the lawsuit is saying, those two things. Number one, to say that, hey, buyer's broker might be steering buyers towards listings that offer higher compensation. And number two, that the seller should have more control over how much they're paying to the listing agent without having to bake in the cost of a potential buyer's broker being involved in the process too. So that is an overview of exactly how the current scenario is playing out. Now let's go into exactly what will happen after mid-July, assuming the judge signs it, which is probably going to be most likely. Let's go. Now, I personally think that there's three main things that will go into effect that every buyer, seller, and even buyer or seller's broker should be hyper aware of. Number one, as the seller, you are now not required to offer a buyer's agent's compensation, although you still can, you're not required to do that. So when you have a conversation with the listing agent and they say, well, my fee is 5% or 6% or 4%, you can ask, okay, well, how much of that fee would have been provided to the buyer's broker? And then can we deduct that from the total fee? So if you're interviewing a seller's agent, and they say, okay, my fee is 5%, you can ask them, okay, well, from that 5%, are you going to be giving, if there's a buyer's broker involved, are you going to be giving half of that, or 2% or 3%? What's the amount that you'll be giving to the buyer's broker? And if it's 2%, for example, then okay, let's make the listing agreement 3%. And if there's a buyer's broker involved, let them submit the offer with the buyer's broker's commission fee in there, and then I can decide whether or not that's something I want to pay or how much I want to pay. So this effectively gives more control to the sellers, which I'm all for. Anything that gives the consumer more control over the decision-making process, more control over their expenses, that's something I think is great for the market, and it will effectively help the market adapt and become more leaner in the favor of the consumers. So I'm totally for that. So again, to recap, the first thing is that you are now, as a seller, not required to offer a buyer's agent commission anymore. You can now negotiate that with your seller's agent to say, okay, whatever the listing fee is, let's see what we can do there in terms of tweaking it, because now I don't have to bake in the buyer's agent cost to that. I totally get that. The second thing is that listing agents are now no longer allowed to advertise in the MLS how much a commission is going to be offered to the buyer's broker. So if you're a seller and you say, you know what, I really want to make sure my house gets sold fast or my property gets sold fast, so I will offer not just the seller's commission, the seller agent commission, but also the buyer's broker commission, even though you still want to offer that, your broker, your listing broker, can still not advertise anywhere in the MLS, because that might indicate that they are trying to get the buyer's broker to steer them towards your listing. So effectively, this is trying to really mitigate any potential or any kind of instances where a buyer's broker can steer their clients to your property. Now again, just to reiterate, we're not saying, or the lawsuit is not saying that you as a seller can't offer a buyer's broker commission if you still would like to, but your listing broker can now no longer advertise that in the MLS, so it'll be treated as a case-by-case basis, or whenever they speak with the buyer's broker, if there's a buyer's broker involved. And number 3, which I'm personally very excited for, is that all buyers are now required to sign a buyer's broker agreement whenever or before they decide to tour any properties with the buyer's agent. Does that mean that some buyer's agents might still not ask or require their clients to do that? Absolutely, why not? Especially if you're working with a client that you already have an existing relationship with. However, this settlement will require this to start happening, even though they've, NAR, National Association of Realtors, has encouraged this for a while. The effect of the settlement will mean that now buyers are required to sign on with the buyer's broker. If they decide to work with a broker, they have to, sign an agreement with that broker. Of course, you as a buyer can go directly to the seller or directly to the listing agent via open house or whatever it is. You're still able to do that, just like you're able to do that before or in this current market, and you'd still be able to do that after the settlement or the law goes into effect in mid-July. But if you do decide to work with a buyer's broker, you will be required to sign a buyer-broker agreement, which I personally am very excited about, especially because I think this will really help a lot of agents that are very good at what they do and they're dedicated to their craft. I think there's been a lot of noise in terms of a lot of agents that sort of get their license and become a buyer's agent just because they think it's easy money, and they're doing their client a disservice by doing that. So I'm personally very excited about this, and just to reiterate, this is something that you as the buyer can negotiate with your buyer's broker. So if they say, hey, my commission is 2% or 3%, and I'll try to get it from the seller, but if not, you're going to be responsible for it, or you're going to be responsible for paying that gap. That's something you can negotiate. Some of my buddies that are buyer's brokers, they're saying, hey, we might try like a flat fee brokerage where, they'll say, okay, $5,000 or $10,000 and that's it. You sign a retainer and then you pay the rest at closing. That might be something. Also like an hourly rate as well. Or there might be even like a catered menu, like if you have a buyer's broker and you only want the basic package to help you review documents and help you write offers, that's a certain fee. Or there's another certain fee if you want more, more hands-on approach. There are different tier packages that I think might probably happen, but effectively from mid-July onwards, every buyer is going to be required to sign a buyer-broker agreement if they want to keep working with the buyer's agent. To reiterate, you don't have to hire a buyer's agent. You can work directly with the seller or work directly with the seller's broker. That is still the case. That has always been the case even before the fact. But I really want to drive that point home. Now let's jump into point 3, which I think is probably going to be the most fun part, which is what are my thoughts and what I think will happen and what my process or how my process is changing moving forward. Let's go right into this. Now, for the fun part in terms of Mos thoughts about this entire process and what I think about it after sort of thinking about it for a while, dissecting it, as well as how I think the process is ultimately going to affect the industry in the long term, and what I'm doing in terms of my own processes now that I know that the law is going to be taken into effect, or most likely will be signed into law by mid-July of 2024. Now, the first thing I want to state is anything that is good for the consumer, I think is going to be profitable for the industry as a long term in the whole, right? So you'll always find people on the waysides or people in the industry, outside of the industry, that say, okay, well, this is messed up, or this is so unfavorable, or oh my God, this is the best thing for consumers, whatever it is. In most cases, what I've seen is that there won't be that big of a shift in the dynamic overall. We might, take an extra direction or step or two, but we're probably going to end up in the exact same scenario. However, ultimately, I feel that anything that's right for the consumer is going to be right for the industry, and it's going to make the industry better in the long term by shaking out a lot of unscrupulous brokers or unscrupulous actors in the industry that really I don't think should have been there in the first place. Now, one thing I want to mention is the settlement was reached with the National Association of Realtors. It is a large trade organization. It's actually one of the largest lobby groups in America. However, you have to understand, not every broker is associated with the National Association of Realtors. So your local board might not have anything to do with NAR. For example, in Manhattan, we have multiple MLSs. In New York City, we have multiple MLSs. Manhattan, for example, is associated with REBNY, Real Estate Board of New York. They're not affiliated with NAR. They're dealing with their own lawsuit and their own settlement, however way they want to do it. So this might be a moot point if you're in an area that's not even associated with NAR, and this video might have been a complete waste of time. I hope not, and I still hope you took away something from it. The second point I want to make is there's really never been any kind of standard commission in real estate. Any agent or any broker that's been in this space for 8 to 12 months can probably tell you if they've been doing it full time. Real estate commissions have always been and will always be negotiable, right? And any agent, the reason I bring that example up, any agent that's been on the buy side or on the sell side has probably worked on transaction where the amount of commission that they've agreed upon with their client has dramatically changed over the course of the transaction just to have the deal go through. I've had friends, including myself, where we've had to renegotiate the commissions multiple times and lower it just to make sure that the deal goes through, because if we didn't do that, then otherwise the deal wouldn't happen. This way, at least we have a happy client or buyer or seller, whatever, whatever side of the transaction you're working on. The third thing that I wanted to point out too, the lawsuit was very specific about in terms of advertising in the MLS, right? So in the past, effectively, if you were a listing agent, you couldn't really put $0 for a buyer's agent commission, right? You could put in $1, you could put in $2, you can put in 5%, you could put in 3%, but before you weren't, or actually the way it is right now, you can't just say, okay, there's going to be 0% buyer's agent commissions, or at least this is what the lawsuit was aiming at. Different MLSs might have different rules. For example, in my area, I've definitely seen MLSs or MLS listings where they were advertising 0% to the buyer's agent commission because they expected the buyer to pay for that, pay for the commission for the buyer's broker if there was a buyer's broker involved, because it might have just been the market or how the deal itself was playing out, right? Now, the one thing I sort of want to point out here is that there's always been flat fee buyer broker commissions. There's always been like listings where the seller or the listing agent might be offering $5, not $5, but like a few $1,000, $10,000, whatever it is. It's on a deal by deal basis, whatever makes most sense for the brokers and for the clients. Obviously, at the end of the day, the client is what comes first. Another thing I also wanted to point, there are already associations and MLSs that have already put this into practice, effectively stating, even before the law goes into effect, that, hey, you have to not advertise openly the buyer's broker commission and, let the buyers and the sellers, the buyer's broker, figure out and negotiate what their commissions will be as the deal sort of goes on, or maybe before, if the broker requires the buyers to sign a buyer's broker agreement. This is the case, for example, in Seattle, the Washington area. That's how their MLS sort of performs or operates, and that's probably one of the closest examples I can think of that's closest to a big city or high cost of living area like New York City or Long Island, right? A couple other few things that I think a lot of people sort of forget. Sellers always have control over the transaction in terms of who they want to list with, if they even want to hire a broker, if they want to put something as a flat fee MLS. So there's websites out there where you can pay like $500, $600, and you get access to the MLS just for your listing. You can still do that, but you'd be the one responsible for all the marketing and the negotiation and everything. These flat fee MLSs, these for sale by owner website, aka FSBOs, they have always existed and they will continue to exist. So that is still a pathway that a seller can take. You're not required to hire a broker. It doesn't matter if you're a buyer or a seller. You're not required to have a broker in the mix if you want to get a transaction done. If you're a seller and you know the buyer and you have an attorney and they have an attorney and everything's good, why do you need to hire a broker? Don't do it. Right? If you really want to get maximum exposure for your property, but you're okay with doing all the work with showings, vetting buyers, verifying all the paperwork and everything, you can, opt to use one of those flat fee MLSs, and then you'll be able to deal with everything. You'll save a bunch of money in terms of the commissions, but your negotiation skills and your understanding of the local market might not be as best as hiring a broker that is very well experienced in your area or maybe even in the region that you're working in. Another thing, and just last thing I wanted to point out, this notion of not openly advertising the buyer's broker commission and things like that, this has always been the case in commercial real estate, right? Commercial real estate is effectively like the wild, wild west. There's no like federal oversight or federal regulations that dictate what might need to be done to be protecting a buyer or a seller, like example, a home property condition disclosure statement. Those things don't exist. So whenever I worked on commercial transactions in the past, the commission has always been up in the air in terms of negotiation. You negotiate as a buyer's broker, you might negotiate that with the listing broker, with the seller directly, with a leasing agent, whatever it is. Those things have always, or that paradigm of operation has always existed in the commercial world. So with that, guys, I think overall, my personal opinion is that the market will probably shake for a little bit. There might be a little bit of a shakeout where we'll see a lot of buyers brokers sort of fade away because they just can't offer the value that their clients need. But what I effectively think will happen is that we're probably going to end up reaching the exact same destination. We're just going to be taking a different route. I mean, think about it from this example. If you're a property owner and you say, hey, you know what, I don't have to offer a buyer's broker commission, but then one of your neighbors is also selling their house at the same time that you're selling their house, now you have an incentive to basically say, okay, I'm going to offer a buyer's broker commission because I want to make it seamless for another buyer broker to come in and negotiate that transaction, because now he or she doesn't have to worry about getting a commission from their buyer. Or, maybe you might even, as a seller, you might even offer a higher broker or buyer broker commission than your neighbor, right? Effectively, this is like what I think is most likely going to happen. Now, you could argue and say, well, Mo, the seller or the buyer might come directly to me now because now they don't have to do that. I personally am not super excited by that idea, especially for first-time buyers or people that might not have as much experience under their belt, because at the end of the day, the listing broker's job, even if they're acting as a dual agent, is to put the best interest of their client, aka the seller, in front of the buyers. So the buyers might be a little bit hanging up and dry. But this goes back to the point that maybe they might want to hire a buyer's broker on like a flat fee basis or like on a consulting basis where they sign a retainer and they pay like an hourly rate maybe. That could still be useful for them when they're going through the transaction, right? Again, those things technically already exist. There's buyer's brokers out there that charge a flat fee. It's not as if this new rule is automatically going to start changing things. Again, my thoughts are that I think the market will go through a little bit of a shakeup, but I expect within 4 to 6 months the market's going to be exactly where we were originally, and people are probably going to be offering anywhere from 2% to 3% of the commission, or the percentage of the sales price for the buyer's broker commission, if there is a buyer's broker involved. Now, in terms of how I'm changing my process, thanks to this new law, effectively moving forward, all new clients, all new buyer clients that I'm working with will have to sign a buyer's broker agreement. This is just the way I'm running my business, because I want to make sure that I want the client to be as invested with me as I am invested with them, because I give all of my clients 100%. And if there's something that I can't take on because I'm working on with too many clients, or I just don't have the bandwidth, or I just don't think it's going to be fruitful because I'm not the best person for this, I will obviously tell you. But if you are watching this and you're one of my clients and you're wondering how this is going to affect you, you definitely need to know that we're going to start having a conversation in terms of signing a buyer's broker agreement, negotiating the commission rate. And again, I will of course try to get my compensation from the seller, but if not, and there's a little bit of a gap, then that's something more of a negotiation and conversation and discussion that we will have upfront, because I'm more than open to working something out, obviously, if there's a good fit. And if there's not a good fit, then I will still point you in the right direction of what to do and where to go, but don't expect to get 100% of my expertise and advice, especially if you haven't or if you decided to not sign a buyer's agreement with me. With that, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's going to be a long one, but I think it's going to be very useful for anyone and everyone that's sort of watching this to get an understanding of what's happening and what my thoughts are and how I'm changing my processes moving forward. I'll let you guys go. See you next week. Bye-bye.